Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 39 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm a little nervous and a lot excited about today's episode. We had originally scheduled the three of us to talk about a pretty complex response, really cool stuff, and I was all excited about it. And then Jerry had to do some debriefing with some folks, a really important thing here a little up north of Denver. And so you just have Curt and I today, and I'm going to share some of my journey and turn the question part of this over to Curt today. So I'm more nervous about this one because Curt owes me like about 150 really tough questions. But I'm excited also to share my journey with our audience as well. So I think we have a great, fun episode today. We also have some really great guests lined up in June as well. So this will kind of be a nice, relaxed one. And then I think the next three episodes will really be great ones as well. So we got a great lineup for you all month, and excited to have Curt hand the question asking over to Curt today. So as always, we start with our bright, shiny objects. And mine this week is, I was able to see some really good friends it's actually friends that the woman of the couple and my wife were roommates in college. And they sort of won the college lottery and went to University of California at Santa Barbara. And so we went down there to sort of reminisce, and what a great place. I went to college. It was a beautiful area in South Central Kentucky, a small town. But if you've never been to Santa Barbara or the university, you walk out and everybody's got their surfboards locked up outside the dorms, and there's a cliff with the Pacific Ocean and a cool lagoon. And I don't know how you walk on that campus as somebody that went to any place else and not be a little bit jealous that my wife and her friend Tracy got to spend 4 years in Santa Barbara. So it was a great trip, and it's just kind of fun to see someone who you love, their history as well, and hear all their stories. So, my bright, shiny object is a fun week in Santa Barbara that I'm coming off of, and almost healthy. Curt and I are both still battling some colds. So health is my second bright, shiny object of the week. By next week, Curt, we're both going to be perfectly healthy. So what about you, my friend? What are you thinking about this week?
Well, I'll say welcome back to reality from you.
Thank you.
In Santa Barbara. I have a technical bright, shiny object. A few months ago, I was reading the book No Drama Discipline, which is a Dan Siegel book, kind of a follow-on to Whole Brain Child, which I think has some really good approaches and strategies in there. And I just kind of recently discovered that there is a No Drama Discipline workbook. And so I was kind of looking at that. And I've been really impressed with it. I being one of the kind of behavioral guys, which is really kind of focuses in on minute moment-to-moment interactions between people and between environment and people. One of the areas that in my perception has been kind of missed in some of the trauma-informed literature and some of the brain-related literature and strategies that have been talked about is what do you do every single moment? They can be very conceptual and then say, yes, you need structure, but that's another book.
Yeah.
And this is one of the first that I have found that matches up really well with what we understand about how the brain works and about how the stress response in the moment can drive differences in perception, and that can result in differences in behavior. And it has some very, very practical strategies in there that also incorporate a good understanding so far from what I've read of how environment behavior interact with each other. And that there can be problems that arise when we interact on a moment-to-moment basis in a way that can send behavior on a different track. And that's a tricky one to kind of pull off together. And this has been it's been fun to look at. I'm certainly looking at ways that I can incorporate it into how we write treatment plans and how we do training for providers who are working with kids all the way to adolescents and even adults, in some of these strategies about how do you do moment-to-moment interactions when somebody is stressed out to help to bring the stress response down. I think one of the key concepts there is in No Drama Discipline, they talk about the difference between the goal of being to try and gain compliance or cooperation and whether or not you want to reward behavior. And I think those are really tricky balances to pull off. And I think that the verbalization and the way that No Drama Discipline has talked about that, I think is a really promising way to look at it. So that's been a kind of bright, shiny object for me over the last couple of days.
Yeah, I keep getting amazed. Sometimes I wonder, is this Dan Siegel book really for me? And every time it hits the top of my list, I'm just really, I've always been impressed by him. He's been one of my role models.
It's a well done resource. I think
absolutely
great activities in this workbook. So if anybody's looking for something that has a good balance of how you do structure and how you incorporate what we know about how the stress response in the brain respond to environmental events, I think this is a really good resource. So if you're looking for something, check it out.
Yep, absolutely. I would second that as well. So the whole brain child also, and Mindsight and the mindful brain. And just you can spend probably 2 years now reading what he's wrote, and it would be a well-spent couple of years. So.
Yeah, I certainly am excited to see this convergence of the behavioral sciences with the brain sciences. And I think that when we start talking to each other, we're really finding out that we're talking about the same things. We're just using different words to describe it. And there are really some benefits on both sides of talking to each other, and both kind of camps and both philosophical approaches, I think, can really benefit from one another.
Absolutely.
The more we talk to.
Very cool. Well, I'm turning it over to you now. So
I'm excited for today.
I know. I'm going to sit here and listen and not direct this thing. So it's
I promise to not ask you too much. But I thought it would be really great after, God, we've been doing this now for, go past 6 months now, and we're getting close to the 40 episode mark.
I know.
And I know that from my experience of having watched some of our podcast and then lots of other ones too, you kind of get a sense of, you get to know people a little bit as you hear them talk. And so I thought it would be kind of fun to do kind of a getting to know Matt episode. And I'm sure we'll go off on lots and lots of tangents as we usually do. But I thought it would be kind of a fun one to do today. So I'm going to start, I'm kind of going to go in chronological order to find a little bit out about Matt, and you can dodge any question that you want. You're not on Meet the Press or anything like that. It's totally fine to dodge.
I'm an open book, my friend.
Well, let's kind of start with where you were born and where you grew up, and let's kind of hear about that from the starting point.
Yeah, so I am a Hoosier from Indiana, and I had a very unique Hoosier experience, and one that was truly Indiana. Is I was raised by a basketball coach / teacher, and my mom was also a teacher. So I was actually born up in northern Indiana in South Bend, and then also moved to a small town called Brookville around Cincinnati, West Lafayette, where most people probably heard of Purdue University is there. And that was my first kind of, a lot of Indiana was rural experiences, and it was just great to be in a college town with a diverse group of friends. And So that was a really cool experience, and then ended up in a suburb on the south side of Indianapolis in Franklin. And so we were moving to chase the next great basketball job. My dad's goal is always to win a state championship. And probably in hindsight, more than I'd like to admit, the first 22-ish years of my life was really revolved around putting a stupid ball through a stupid hoop. Whether that was my dad's obsession with winning or my own athletic career. So yeah, I was traveled around the state, got to see a lot of different kind of corn throughout Indiana. But yeah, born and raised a Hoosier, so.
That's really cool. One of my favorite movies is Hoosiers.
Oh, I would argue the greatest sports movie ever, though that's probably a separate podcast all on its own.
And you know, I use it. I'm kind of going to ask you a little more questions about brain development related
Yes.
to your upbringing, right? So one of my scenes from Hoosiers is at the beginning when Gene Hackman's character, right? He's the coach, and he comes in and he has this team with one good player and 4 average players, and their whole strategy is get the ball and give it to Jimmy, right?
Yeah.
Just give it to your player. And one of the things that the coach says to them is he gives them a rule that you have to make 4 passes before you take a shot. Mm-hmm. And I've used that as an analogy with young professional clinicians as they think about what do I do when I'm sitting across the table from somebody who's seeking professional services from me, and their urge is to always give advice too quickly.
Yeah.
And so I've given them this rule of ask 4 questions before you give any advice.
I love it. I love it.
What typically happens is, of course, they ask questions and they get information that they wouldn't have had otherwise. Yeah. And they get curious. Yes. And it becomes more than 4 questions.
Yes.
And they end up almost never giving any advice. They ask a lot of questions that result in some insight. And
I love it. I love it. Yeah, so many, this was, again, Indiana. It's just this kind of experience. My homeroom teacher all through high school was the center for Milan, who was the team that Hoosiers was based on. So, yeah, that was really, he had all the old newspaper articles and a little less dramatic than the movie in real life. Not quite the abuse of players and some other stuff that made the movie pretty great. But it was really cool to hear his stories about his experience. So it sort of came to life. And we had a lot of family friends. You could dress up in the garb of the time, which most people were still wearing in Indiana at the time, and go and be an extra of the movie. So even now when it scans through the crowd, I see some family friends every time it does it. So really? Yeah, it was a really cool experience when that movie came out. So
I got a couple of questions from really kind of looking at an attachment kind of lens.
Yeah.
When there are 2 things that I kind of just heard in what you said that I'm curious about. So one is thinking about the experiences you had being in kind of a competitive environment, right? Mm-hmm. And that your dad was a big part of that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious kind of as you think now about many years later, as you've learned about how attachment works mm-hmm. and how those important parental relationships are so key in the moment. Yeah. I'm wondering if you have some insight about how that's impacted you as an adult. And also the other side of that is, of course, being a part of a team at a very young age.
Yeah.
That must have had some kind of an impact on you. And how do you see that playing out now in your professional life? And do you take any stories from those times, when you're out training and talking to people about these really important concepts? So
yeah.
Thoughts about those 2 things?
Yeah, I was really fortunate, and I think about, the more psychology has always been so fascinating to me because, especially when you just get into it, you start to learn so much about yourself so quickly. I feel like after now, I've been reading psychology almost for, it's getting like in the 30-year range that I've been since I probably picked up the first book in way back in probably early high school or middle school. And, I really realized how lucky I was. Even though my family wasn't perfect, growing up, I was lucky to have like two real solid parents who, I think had so many more strengths than flaws by any stretch of the imagination. But just really, I never questioned that they loved me. And I think that gave me that secure base at a really early age, that I'm just fortunate for. I think after especially working with so many youths and then adults that didn't get that experience, I realized, how lucky I was to always have that sense of security. Looking back, of being raised by two educators, we were never wealthy by any stretch. And I think, I think about now, like as an adult and, somebody who doesn't have kids, you have a lot more expendable income, and the sacrifice they gave. And this kind of connects to the second part of the question is, I went to college to play basketball, and my mom attended quite a bit, but even as somebody who had to wake up and work the next day, and travel at least 3 hours, sometimes a lot more to my games, he probably made 80% of my games. And that's just the sort of, support that I got. Didn't always come across in the most kind way. My dad was sort of in the Bobby Knight mentality of coaches. So, there's a really interesting thing, and I carry this with me and think about it quite a bit still, is, our lives really revolved around teenagers winning or losing basketball games. That was it. Now, my dad may have cared more about being a teacher than he kind of let on, but, it was Friday and Saturday night is when the games were in Indiana, because that's all there was to do in town. So, you would have, as a 16-year-old, you're playing in front of 3,000-4,000 people on a normal Friday night. In a town of 18,000, you get like 25% of the people showing up for a basketball game. And that relying on team and really understanding, I think it gave me a real interest in leadership. I sort of got into psychology because I growing up in high school, I wanted to be a basketball coach myself. And I'm like, and of course I'm already planning it out. I could be like, I could get my undergraduate degree. I knew I wasn't got the athletic ability to go play pro, at least in the United States. And so I was like, then I could go get a graduate assistant and go get a PhD. And, I thought the psychology would help me be a better coach. And, eventually the love for psychology well eclipsed my desire to keep, create my life around 18-year-olds putting a ball through a hoop. But, that competitive nature, I think sports served me well. While at times being the son of a basketball coach in Indiana at the time was, everybody's supposed to be like Steve Alford or Larry Bird. And we're not all Steve Alfords and Larry Birds. And so, you're supposed to be this, golden child who's supposed to, to win the state championship. And, unfortunately I had the vertical leap of a cow. So, it wasn't quite in the cards. I was a really good player, but wasn't the golden child. And so there were ups and downs with that. And my dad was always supportive, though. Again, his life continued to be about winning or losing. And then I became a big part of that equation. But, at the same time, I was raised, we had a family. The team was sort of my big brothers, they would always take me in and sometimes probably teach me life lessons way before I was ready to learn them at times. But hanging out in the locker room and all that was a really fun part most of the time, too, of being a part of a team. And especially when we were winning, that was fun.
So how is it, what I know about your current professional life, you do a lot of training, and you end up kind of being on your own a lot.
Yeah.
How is that for you, having this kind of team-oriented approach, but also you're kind of a lone wolf a lot. How does that, work for you, and what kind, does it lead to any kind of thoughts about other things that you want to do besides what you're doing now? I know you're thinking into the future.
Yeah, and it's been an interesting kind of career-wise with this. It's been a balance of sort of, I think a lot of times, especially early on in my career, I was looking to either create or become a part of a great team. I kind of got, as boy, now that it's not based on my ability to jump or run fast, but just think and work hard and smart, that, I really wanted to be a part of something great. And I've had some chances, especially as I got promoted probably way too quickly, developmentally speaking, I was basically starting to supervise programs and staff 6 months into my career out of undergrad, which I realized I had no clue what I was doing very quickly. I take that with me. And I think one of the things that somehow got in my head very early in life is I was never the smartest kid, like never close to the smartest kid in any class. So I learned something though, and I think I learned this from a real young age, is that if I outworked everybody, my grades were just as good as the smart kids in class. I think my basketball career was a great example of that. Even though I'm pretty tall, I could not even really run. Like my growth spurt, I grew like 6 months over a summer in high school, and it took like really 6 years to recover from that growth spurt alone. But I really learned that if I outwork people, so I think, in my career, I've really looked, especially, as the trauma piece comes on and seeing these social justice issues that are impacting the people that I've worked with and care about, trying to either be a productive member of a team or a movement, like the trauma-informed care movement, for example, whether it's a formal team that I get to work in or whether it's doing things like with you and Jerry on the podcast. I've been lucky enough, fortunate enough, and strategic enough to try to surround myself with really great people. So if I find myself kind of in a position like I am now, where I'm doing a lot of work independently, I know every week I get, at least see you guys virtually for the podcast. And I just have these really brilliant, great, kind of professional friends, though, they're just great friends as well that I learned so much from. So, even when I don't have the formal team, I try to create informal teams to hopefully have positive changes on things that I care about.
So let's kind of go back to college a little bit. I want to hear a little bit about this, right? Because that must have been a pretty interesting time. I mean, in one sense, there was a shift that must have happened about then between being focused in on being a great basketball player one day to a totally different way of thinking about yourself in the world and how you fit. And how did that happen? And when did that happen? What was that like?
Yeah, so it happened, I would say, probably around sophomore, junior year. And it was kind of with the loss of the dream that, like, I'm not going to play professional basketball. I'm not going to be the Scottie Pippen that comes out of the small college and, wins 6 or 7 championships or whatever, how many rings he has. And so part of that was that realization. And then I was sort of faced with, well, do I still want to be a coach? Because I watched what my dad, when you're winning, I don't know if there's a better life. If your community cares about what you're coaching, It's really fun. We never had to pay for the dentist. Certain restaurants we didn't have to pay for. In Indiana, if you were a winning basketball coach, you were way more popular than the mayor. So we were sometimes celebrities and sometimes the most despised people in town. So, so part of that was it's like, do I really want this? And at the same time, I think it was just somewhat growing up as well. As, I went to a small college in South Central Kentucky, which was actually, just to put it in perspective, was actually a dry county. So you couldn't even buy alcohol in this county. That gives you an idea of how remote sort of this place. I didn't even know those existed anymore. And I'm from Indiana, so I'm not like from New York City. I was like, wait a minute, I thought Prohibition ended in the 30s, and yet here I went back to that time and place. But the really cool thing about being in the middle of nowhere, and also being an athlete where I had to really stay on campus a lot more than the regular student, is I started to fall in love with a couple different streams of knowledge. And one of those was philosophy, especially existentialism. I'm a Nietzsche guy, I think it's Sartre. I always pronounce it wrong, Sartre. My French accent never really developed. But that just kind of opened my eyes to a whole different way of thinking. And then the Rollo Mays of the world and others kind of really connected that to the psychology piece of things. And I really just spent college either on the basketball floor or in the library, just because all this knowledge was so fascinating to me. And really, again, it was around that sophomore, junior year where it's like, I could help people, and winning basketball games is fun and coaching is kind of fun. And you get that immediate feedback on how well you're doing, which we don't get a lot in our field. You either win or you lose. But at the same time, it's like, man, I could really make a difference in people's lives. And to me, that became a really all-encompassing passion of mine. It's like, wow, I could spend 40 hours plus a week helping people live better lives. And that really hit me very powerfully around then. And I was just like I said, swimming in some great new ways of thinking for me. And I found psychology and healing as a way to bring all this philosophy I was reading, all this science I was reading. There wasn't a whole lot of neurobiology that I was exposed to there, but quantum physics came into my life and all these things, like different ways of thinking. Then I could go use those in a practical way to help people heal. And I was just like, man, what else could you ask for in life? Like, you're doing something positive, it's challenging, and nobody really told me you'd never really make any money doing it, but hey, at least you got all the other pieces of a great career coming together. So, that piece, and going to a small college where I all of a sudden was kind of the smartest person in a lot of the rooms all of a sudden, basically because I just never stopped reading, is, I got exposed and I got a lot of great, my professors were just like, would take hours to discuss my crazy ideas. And so I got some of really great individual attention and exposure there as well. And they love me being a nerd and I love being a nerd. And so it's like, yeah, this would be a pretty good way to live life. So that was sort of that transition. And it's just like basketball, I was getting burned out by it. It's just like, I spent all this time, all this energy, all this emotional and psychic energy on a game. And again, and the funny thing is, when I thought that, then our senior year, we went to nationals. So all of a sudden I cared a lot less, and we ended up having the best season by far of my 4 years. So go figure.
Thinking to shift for 1 second about the idea of teams.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think, from kind of go back a couple of episodes, even where we're talking about social networks and social connectedness, and teams are such an interesting microcosm of that, and the experience of being on a team, especially when there's winning and losing involved.
Yeah.
You have these two extremes of an emotional continuum where on either end of those extremes, being a part of a group can be incredibly powerful. Yeah. When winning is a very, very strong emotional experience, most often. Yeah. Being able to connect with a group around that emotional experience is incredibly powerful, as is losing. Yeah. Losing is an incredibly powerful emotional experience in our culture. And so having a group that you can be tied to when you go through that, not to mention the daily grind of stress and, physical exertion and pain that you have to go through in order to get the opportunity to play in a game. Yeah. It's another one where being connected to a group can be really important. I often have thought of that in the environments that you and I have both worked in residential settings and in really, especially adolescence, I think, and how important it is to create a sense of social connectedness, and how rarely we do it. Yeah. It becomes very individualized rather than group oriented. And there are challenges with making it group oriented, but I wonder if you've kind of gone through that kind of a process of making the parallel between what you went through and as a child and how that
Yeah.
impacted you, and also could we replicate that? Because
Right.
that turned out pretty well, right?
Yeah.
You've done fine. And repeating those things, I think, as we think about what's really great for development and social connectedness among
Yeah.
people who didn't have it as easy as you did, relatively speaking. It's thoughts about that as you.
Yeah. Well, and I think the team thing has been, again, getting into leadership really early on in my career. I think we share this, but there was something also, and it was kind of like an awakening in my adolescence. And, I probably can't point to the exact time and date, but it's like, we were striving to win all these games. We're trying to be a great team. And I think just growing up in that, I taken that into my work in the helping professions. I've always sort of, when I was a part of a team, I'd sort of eventually take on the captain role or the leadership role, or, I was kind of the glue. I was never at all close to probably the top 15 players on any campus that I ever had been on. And yet, by about the time the season started, I was in the starting 5 most years. And so, it was just like, I sort of realized that, even though if you have a lot of people with talent, there needs to be a tension of putting that talent together in a way and then leading it, whether it's during a game or whether that's, a 40-hour work week, to really achieve its maximum results. And going into the helping profession, I was, sort of cursed and sort of blessed to be part of 2 of the worst organizations I've ever seen for my first couple jobs, the first few years of my career. And I saw really clearly the bad leadership and the impact of really some terrible leadership on the ability to help others. Because even though I wasn't in a leadership position originally, I saw that we weren't doing good work. And that was really a result, as I saw more of not the individual pieces that were there, even though we had some pretty bad pieces, but we had some good pieces as well, is that we couldn't come together, or we hadn't found a way really to come together to all bring our best selves to the work. And that really got me, my passion for what was sort of going to be coaching really then shifted really quickly in my career to how do we create great teams, great organizations, great systems, so that we can maximize the limited resources we have to have the most impact possible on folks. So, that team aspect, whether it's the 3 of us doing this podcast, I knew we were, I think we're great. I hope our listeners do as well, but because we had that dynamic going, and I know we've got some very different personalities, but yet there's that core that brings us together to try to do the best that we can every week to have a meaningful impact on what we care about. And I think to knowing that there's people, whether they're experiencing homelessness, whether they're adolescents struggling with mental illness, whether it's trying to educate and help somebody thrive in school, so much of our outcomes are based on the relationship we create with each other, the people we're working with, but so much what determines our ability to create that relationship is what kind of team and organizational culture we're working in. So, even though you don't get that win or loss feedback, I think the challenge is a lot greater than winning a basketball game. But the rewards, again, I think are so much, to me, they're so much greater. If you can help one person find the life and the way to live the life that they want to live, what's a national championship compared to that? That's where I love the work that we get to do. And I see it, every day as such an honor to be a part of that for people.
So from college to Colorado.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, there was a stop after that in Muncie, Indiana. It's funny. I've never really, early on in my life, never really had anybody that gave me really great advice academically. Like I was talking to a friend yesterday, is I never really thought that I could go to an Ivy. I had the grades probably to do it, but nobody said, hey Matt, have you thought about going out east to college, or do you know there's this place called UC Santa Barbara out in California that you could go to? Like maybe not play basketball there, but you could go to you've got the brain and the right mix to go to these places. And so then I went to undergrad, and all of a sudden I graduated like top of my class, and got all these awards. And so I was like, oh, well then I'll just start applying to the top doctoratorial programs in the country. That was my response to it. It's like, oh, I've got this Lindsey Wilson thing done where I went to undergrad. So now I can apply to the University of Georgia and Notre Dame and Harvard, all these great counseling psych. I looked at the top 5 and said, right out of undergrad, I'll apply right away. And if you know anything about this, usually go to the master's programs first. There's like 1% gets right into those doctoral programs. But so I kind of crashed and burned because I didn't have kind of the guidance, and I really probably didn't have, the brain power to be that 1%. I'm not the 1%. If I work really hard, I might be in the top 5, but so I kind of, Ball State was kind of the fallback one. So I spent 3 years in Muncie, Indiana, studying at Ball State in counseling psych, working in juvenile justice, and then child welfare residential. I got to start a housing program there for what we called runaway youth and youth really aging out of the system, because I saw that as such a detriment really early on in my career. Is working with gang members, we would send the gang members after they were at the facility for 9 months right back to their community and expect them to change something. So that allowed me to create a program that gave people different options if they were motivated to sort of get out of the life they were leading. And then I also, as I mentioned, worked for 2 really bad organizations, neither of which I think are around anymore. They were that mismanaged. And I was promoted about 6 months in to oversee basically a cottage at the residential facility, and then hired to start this new program. And I always liked group therapy a little bit better than individual therapy. I like the systems perspective of doing group work. And then when I got promoted to management, I saw that as a larger systems approach. I kind of saw it as the next step beyond group therapy, is now I'm in charge of really bringing on training the best staff possible and setting them up in positions to be successful with the folks. So it gave me a little bit more of the system healing approach. But I also realized really quickly, I had no idea what I was doing. Even though through sports, as we've talked about, I might have had some of that not natural leadership, but I developed some leadership skills. But that didn't help me really manage now things that we call vicarious and secondary trauma that, looking back, was I saw really devastate these organizations. So going into my career as being trained as a therapist, I really fell in love with the leadership. Got to do a double major, both in counseling psych, but also what was one of the first nonprofit leadership development degrees out there. They called it executive leadership at the time, and just fell in love. I took a business like organizational theory class, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Like, this is all, they had no idea about psychology. All these helping organizations had no idea about business. And I'm like, so instead of reading a few books, which would have been the normal response, I started looking for Masters of Business Administration because I love the leadership piece and I wanted to build my skills. So I also had to get out of the Midwest too. I just needed, I needed to explore the rest of something. So I started just looking around really the world, but mostly in the United States, for where'd be a great place to live, and also that I could get an MBA. And I was also looking for something in healthcare specifically, and University of Colorado, Denver had a great program. I visited Denver on a basketball trip out west that I was in high school, and I just remember about the whole Western United States. It's like, why don't we live here? I just remember driving around the West and seeing all the mountains and the valleys. I'm like, this is just freaking awesome. There's more than corn. Like, nothing wrong with Indiana, but it's like, okay, I think I want to spend the next part of my life here. So a lot of mountains, the right business education that I wanted to get. And, you know, the 300 Days of Sunshine sounded really good back in the day as well. So that kind of got me out here to the highlands of Colorado. So
had you met Sarah by that point?
I had not. I met Sarah in, I think, about 2003. We actually worked together. As she likes to say, we did not date while we worked together, to make that clear to everybody. But yeah, so we met through work, and then she went off because she is the smart one of the group. She got a full ride fellowship to Columbia University in New York City. So I like to say I can't brag necessarily about my education, but I married a Ivy League grad at least. And so she went out to New York, and then when she came back, I convinced her to go out on a date with me, and the rest is sort of history from there.
And was this in Colorado?
What's that?
Was this in Colorado?
Yeah, this was in Colorado. So
right. So
yeah,
we're getting close to kind of a key point here, which is, when did you get introduced to Jerry Ager and the ACEs study?
the moment, right? So I got here. So I moved to Colorado in traditional Matt fashion. I didn't have a job. I was not quite yet graduated from my one master's degree, but I already started my second master's degree. I was a week or so from graduating, so it wasn't that crazy. But I, you know, so I moved here, no job. I found a place, and you know, the funny thing, coming from the suburbs, I didn't really realize you could live in a downtown area. Like this did not, in Indianapolis at the time, there wasn't kind of a cool downtownish area. And my sister came out here with me to look at places to move. And I just ended up in what's called Capitol Hill of downtown Denver. And I was just so thrilled with the movie Rent at the time too, or the musical Rent. And it's like, oh, I could live like these people do in a downtown kind of cool bohemian area. And so I moved to downtown Denver, and I was really I was kind of doing consulting. One of my classmates, and the MBA program that I was in was really interesting, because all of a sudden, here I was the youngest person ever admitted into the program. I think they had a very low year. That's the only way. Like I kind of had to I kind of have 3 years of supervisory experience to get in. It was pretty close. It was maybe more 2.5, but I rounded up. And so somehow they let me in this program, and all these people were vice presidents and presidents of not only hospitals, but even healthcare systems. It was an executive program, so people would fly in from all over the country to come in. So all of a sudden, they had expense accounts. And so we would have meals that were almost 20% of my salary. I didn't realize meals cost, we spent $1,500 on wine one night. And it's and they brought out these cards that had it's wow, that would be really cool. Of course, I never quite got to that level, but so I was kind of just living the bohem life, just doing some consulting for some classmates. Had run a school. I know we share this with what it was called, I think it's still called duly diagnosed developmentally disabled children. So kids with low IQs, sometimes violent behaviors coming from traumatic backgrounds. And I kind of got out of that, and I was sort of in this weird position in my kind of later 20s that I had this MBA, I had 2 master's degrees, some really good experience behind me. And I just was looking around, and I heard rumors about this Dr. Jerry Ager guy in Denver Children's Home. And I was so I kept an eye on their website and saw that they had a quality assurance director come up. And it's that was something I had not had on my resume, but having an MBA in our field got me through some doors that I normally wouldn't have got into. So I gave it a shot because I'd heard so many good things about Jerry. And so he hired me on. I don't think he knew what a quality assurance director was supposed to do. I kind of could make some stuff up. It was funny coming in Denver Children's Home. Nobody knew how to use any kind of technology. They all opened their documents through Word. So if you tried to send the Excel spreadsheet, they couldn't open it because they tried to open it through Word. It was like a totally like cool Jerry scenario. And so, I come in there and he sat me down probably a month or so in and gave me the ACE study and said, this is a lot of what we're trying to deal with, and how would this work from a quality perspective? And it was just a pivotal moment of my life, to be honest. And it's a little over dramatic, but not much, because all of the behaviors that, sort of frustrated me, not so much frustrated me personally, but like that I knew would keep my people in these dangerous situations and didn't kind of allow them to break free of patterns. Once I started to learn about the neurobiology, I really started to learn about the why behind these behaviors and how to focus program development in there. And so from that moment, about that time too, Jerry, I was getting bored as quality assurance director, surprise, surprise. So I started to also oversee some of the community-based programming as well. And it just, the trauma-informed piece, the ACE study, the neurobiology, all of a sudden gave me this different platform it gave me a science to build interventions on top of. And that to me was like just this brilliant piece of gold that I found. And so I just started to read and read and read and read pretty much everything I could on that. So that was sort of the moment. And I said, boy, everybody needs to learn about this. I remember that very early on. First it was holy bleep, everything I've been doing is pretty much wrong. Holy bleep, now I know how to do things differently, but nobody's funding me to do them that way. And then holy bleep, everybody needs to know about this. So that was sort of my immediate 3 responses to Jerry introducing me to this new topic.
And so from the Denver Children's Home experience, which is one of those great ones, right? There's
yes.
A pivotal point in a kind of career direction.
Yeah.
You've had several experiences from there that have been creating organizations, creating trainings, and kind of positioning yourself to where you are now. How has that process gone for you?
Yeah, it's been a fun, I kind of compare it to like body surfing or, something where you don't have a whole lot of control, but you're on this wave and it just kind of takes you to new and interesting places. So, there was sort of this moment where it's like, okay, after I thought everybody in the world needs to hear about this, it was kind of a weird spot. And this was probably back around 2004, 2005, is because of Jerry, because in Denver, we have the Kemp Center. So, I sort of thought that there's plenty of people doing training on trauma-informed care. Where I thought and where I started to develop my thinking around was, okay, we have this thing on trauma-informed care, but this also has huge ramifications for organizational culture. I started to learn about vicarious and secondary trauma. So there was all this sort of like, okay, I can use my psychology part of my brain and my business part of the brain. And I really started out thinking about trauma-informed leadership. And how do we use this information to inform how we create, maintain healthy teams and organizations? So I just sort of assumed there were plenty of trauma-informed care trainers out there. And so I started doing that and started to get some training work while I was at Denver Children's Home. That's sort of another kind of cool life moment is that started to really grow, both in leadership, and I was also doing just some basic like motivational interviewing training and other things as well. And that got to the point where my wife's kind of career got to the point where, when you live in Denver, you always kind of want to go live up in the mountains. And so I was at a point where I could do enough on my own with the work to justify moving to this little hippie town outside Boulder called Netherland that I spent 7 years at. Ski resort right outside of town, funky hippies everywhere, great music scene and art scene. And so, it allowed me kind of to live that life of sort of the independent trainer, even though I've been part of different groups. And then as I was doing the leadership thing, people asked more and more as, okay, you mentioned I would always introduce the concepts of trauma, and people started to ask me to do more and more of that training. And so when I talk about being on this wave, it was kind of leadership, and then leadership kind of led into self-care. And then, then I just started the trauma trainings. I must have been doing something fairly well, because that then just exploded. And so that's been, I'd say, for the last 6 years, just amazing to watch. I realized there was a need for another trainer out there, and have been honored. The National Healthcare for the Homeless Council saw me early on with my friend Dr. Deborah Bourne doing a presentation. So I kind of became their trauma guy for about 3 or 4 years, which just gave me a national platform to work off of. So, it just kind of was a gradual thing. And then my wife and I looked around and said, hey, we could move to the mountains. And we had that great experience for several years, living kind of the hippie mountain lifestyle while I was just reading and training all over the country, which was just a really cool and unexpected thing to come about. So
in the leadership realm, and there are a lot of different kind of philosophies and approaches to leadership, and there certainly is a lot of attention on that.
Yeah.
Both on in the nonprofit world, in the healthcare world, and it really seems to be kind of blossoming in the healthcare world.
Yeah.
And certainly in the business world. And it seems to be a lot of different approaches to it, right? So you can have we got guys like Simon Sinek, who is very a caretaking kind of leader. And then you have things like servant leadership is another one. And, even some of David Rock's work on quiet leadership and those kinds of things. Are there some things that you see that are common elements of good leadership approaches? And are there some things that you think are kind of pitfalls to leadership approaches?
Great question.
That you would kind of share with some of the listeners?
Yeah. So first of all, to take leadership seriously, that's, to me, I was going again to get the Master's of Business Administration. You walk into a hospital or a health system, and all their executive team have either have MBAs or have gone through extensive leadership training. And I think one of the things in the nonprofit world, especially with smaller organizations, is there's a lot of people like I was, who was promoted to supervise staff and never given a minute of training on how to do that effectively. And I always like to say I had to go to 3 years of graduate school to call myself a therapist. And I would argue that leadership is just as complex, if not at times more complex than me doing therapy. Because you got systems things, you got funding to think about, you got a lot of other things. So, but I didn't have a minute, 1 second of training about how to do that effectively. So paying attention to it and developing leaders, that's got to be core to what we do. Because a lot of times we'll promote the good therapist into a management position. Not only do we lose the good therapist because they're no longer doing therapy, but now we have a bad, untrained manager who doesn't have the skill set to succeed. So one is just to pay attention to it. And then, so some of my real thinkers on this that I love is Jim Collins' work. Was really my introduction to leadership in a real concrete, strategic way. Built to Last, Good to Great. Really, if you're looking for a leadership book and it has Jim Collins' name on it, I pick it up. It's just great. So gave me all of a sudden, this research-based stuff coming out. So Collins' work kind of hit me the same time as the Gallup 12 stuff was coming out. So Buckingham, and there were some other authors, First Break All the Rules, and 12 was another book. I think 12 Leadership, What Great Managers Do, something like that. So there was all sort of this best practices, research-based stuff coming up. And it really, to me, showed that it's about the relationships. Great leaders have really great relationships. So, I was kind of coming and in the leadership transition from kind of that authoritarian sort of approach, the kind of Jack Welch sort of superstar CEO that, Jack Welch was the CEO of GE, and I think a brilliant guy, and he fired 10% of his workforce pretty much every year. It's like, if you were at the bottom 10%, you were fired. I was like, God, that's got to be, how many people are on medication just because of that? and so, I was part of that transition. And, going back to my dad being that a very authoritarian Bobby Knight kind of coach, it really started to show that there was that softer side of leadership, that relational piece that really drove outcomes more than really anything else. And so, I really got from the Collins of the worlds and the Buckingham, that Gallup 12 research that's come out, gave me a real good research-based foundation. And then I was, I think, in just a great position to kind of add my psychological training to that, and really helping in these extreme environments that have trauma walking through the door every day, how to help people create and maintain healthy organizational cultures has just been a continued just great challenge that I love. So I would say Collins, any of the Gallup 12 stuff have been sort of my baseline of where I kind of work from. And then, there's great books out there on recognition, great books on engagement. And so then there's, like, everything else is kind of moons around the Jim Collins sort of orbit that I kind of build my overall style off of. So that's the simple answer. We could do a whole podcast on building, talking about those leadership resources, but I will spare us that hour-long rant.
We got just a couple of minutes left. I wonder, kind of last thing to kind of wrap it up as you think about where you are now and where you want to go.
Yeah, so one of the things that my recent change, and it's been about a year now since I jumped out to really just being on my own solo, is, the experience of writing Connecting Paradigms and publishing it was such a really cool thing. I started a blog that you can find on the website. If you go to traumainformedlens.org, you can find it there. And that I really enjoyed the writing piece of it. And then doing the book form, I thought was just, it was a really fun experience. It was a hard experience, but I really enjoyed giving people another resource. And I kind of wrote that book because so often I go and introduce trauma-informed care to people in the neurobiology and epigenetics and do my kind of one-day thing, hopefully to get them interested and educated on that. But then it's kind of the now what, right? And so because in a full day, I don't have a lot of chance to go into the skill sets. What I tried to do through Connecting Paradigms was really, okay, here's a way you can communicate. Here's a way you can set up change process and approach the work and kind of answering that question. And so I'm excited to keep writing. I've got kind of the next 4 books in my head. Right now, I haven't really announced this publicly, but since you asked such good questions, Curt, my wife and I, my wife's a first grade teacher, if you're a new listener, are writing a book on trauma-sensitive elementary education. So really from that classroom perspective. So that's going to dominate the next probably year, 14 months of my life, is getting that thing done and out to the world. And then, I'm interested. I think the leadership thing is, like we talk about quite a bit, I see that coming to the top now. I don't think there wasn't a whole lot of thinking around that because so many people were thinking about just trauma in general, because that's where we've been developmentally. And it's kind of fun to now see is, okay, trauma-informed care, we're really trying to do this, but what's this mean for the larger organizational and system? So I'm hoping after the school stuff to really then focus more attention on kind of answering your question in a lot of detail about, okay, how do you take the neurobiology, the trauma research, and integrate that into best practice of leadership? And so that's really, and I'm looking at that from a school perspective with this project, but I'm really excited about that next step too, because I think that's sort of where things are moving towards, which I think is really exciting. I think I was just like 12 years too early to focus on that at the time. Not everybody knew what trauma-informed care was, so trying to sell trauma-informed leadership to folks wasn't really ready there, but it's nice to see that that's really coming into people's thinking now as well. So I'm really excited that trauma-informed schools, trauma-sensitive schools is a thing. I think there's so many upstream interventions that we can do so people don't end up in the criminal justice system or in poverty and homelessness if we give them the right resources. So I'm really excited to have a real strong footing in that and working with a lot of districts. And yeah, that leadership piece is calling me as well. So that's where I really see probably the next 4 or 5 years will be really focused on those two things. So yeah.
Well, there you have it. We know where Matt's headed at this point. We'll all wait and see.
And that wave will take me wherever it wants to, too. That's where I just have to be okay with that. And it's been just an amazing trip. You know, and the fact that I think we both feel this at times, that people see us and you know, ask us questions, and to kind of be at this point in the career a resource to people, and that my expertise that I've worked so hard to build, and I know you have as well, can really help people in this important work. And you know, what a cool thing to be to people like that are changing people's lives every day and helping people find hope. The fact that we get to be maybe sometimes an escape for them, but hopefully a fun learning experience, is just a really cool thing as well.
Very cool. I hope I certainly enjoyed asking the questions and hearing the answers. So I hope everybody else enjoyed getting to know Matt a little bit better. And we'll sign off for the week. And
absolutely. And thank you. This was fun for me too. I was nervous about it, and now it gives me permission to have a Curt episode here.
I don't know about that
as well. So yeah, how did this happen? So yeah, so thank you, Curt. I appreciate it as always. You can find I'll find some kind of discussion question to throw out about this episode, but show notes, episode, discussion questions, and other resources at traumainformedlens.org. And also see videos. If you've not seen us live and me waving my hands around a lot, you can see us on YouTube or go to the website as well. So I want to thank everybody. We have a great guest. Actually, somebody Jerry and I both worked with at Denver Children's Home, Dr. Brown. Melody Brown will be joining us next week, and we're going to talk about microaggression, which helps explain the trauma of racism, heterosexualism, and a lot of the issues that can happen over the span of a lifetime, but we know can also have some of those same neurobiological impacts. So I'm really excited to bring Melody on. She, I think, just got her doctorate degree, so it's fun to call her Dr. Brown, being a part of her career in little stages. So join us next week. And Curt, thank you. And Jerry will join us next week from Banff, Canada as well. So we'll get an update from him as Jerry's up in the north. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week.